Thank you for tuning in today. We're in the garden here and we're going to harvest some honey and answer your questions. And as always, there's lots of great questions that come in, and if you know the answer to them, then jump in there and help answer them. That's what it's all about. It's about sharing the love of beekeeping and helping each other answer those questions. So I'm just going to put these little shelf brackets on while you think up your questions. And if you have a look at this hive, you can see that there's not a whole lot of honey, but there's still 2 frames we haven't harvested recently. So you can see there that these ones are full but a little bit patchy, showing the bees are a bit hungry. So we'll just harvest 1 frame today and leave anything else in the hive for the bees.
And Cedar, we have inspected to see these frames are actually full.
Well, you can see in the side window here that one is nice and full. So I'm going to harvest that one. When you see the bees are a bit hungry, there is a chance they could eat some honey out of the centre right above the brood nest. They don't tend to do that on the edges so much. But the pattern in the back really lets you know what's going on in the hive if you tune in. And after a while, you get to get the feel of what this looks like and what's going on inside, and you'll know harvest your hive. We're just going to put a jar under there. For those that are just tuning in, we're going to harvest a little bit of honey this morning. We're also going to answer your questions. So questions in the comments below and we'll answer them live. And also, if you know the answer to questions, then help everybody by answering. It's a wonderful thing to share your knowledge. That's what it's all about. We're just going to turn this key here, and it's often good to do it in segments, or you might just decide to harvest half the frame and leave the rest for the bees. The flow frames are quite versatile like that. You could just harvest 1 single cell line if you wanted to. You can see it flowing down this cell line now, and what's happening is the honey's flowing down through the honeycomb matrix and into the bottom now.
So why turn the key, Cedar? What's happening?
So what's happening is half of every cell is moving upwards, creating zigzagging channels, allowing the honey to flow down through the comb into the trough at the bottom and out, which is my father and I's invention that really created waves back in 2015. And it's we're now happy that we've got beehives all over the world, and a lot of you out there are really enjoying it, and thank you so much for tuning in. So go ahead with your questions. Okay, I'm just going to turn this key once more. We'll just harvest the rest of the frame like that, and all that I've got to do now is swap over these jars. Now, if the bees were hungry and they started to come for the honey, then of course we could cover this up with a bit of kitchen wrap or a honeybee wrap, those nice cloth ones.
Hey Cedar, we've got a good question from Sam this morning saying, how does honey get crystallised and what can we do about it?
Okay, all honey will crystallise eventually, provided it's honey that is ready. The question is, how long will it take? Now, crystallising is a normal thing. If you've got honey that never crystallises, then it's possible that it's from the supermarket and it's been pasteurised, so it's been heated to the point where it will not crystallise. And to me that's not a good thing, because you lose all of those precious qualities, those life-enriching qualities of vitamins, minerals and phytonutrients get compromised, and the enzymes and medicinal qualities by that heating pasteurisation process. So you're best off leaving it raw. Now, if you remember back in when you're in school doing those experiments where you get a saturated solution of something, and this is basically a saturated solution of sugars, and it starts off quite liquid, and then the bees they take away the moisture through various techniques, and what that does is get you to this saturated solution, and it's a mixture of different sugars, and depending on the ratios of sugars and the temperature and the moisture content, all these sort of things, you will get different candying times. So typically if it's colder, it will candy earlier. So if you put your honey in the fridge...
So did you mind saying that again for anyone who might have missed it because of the plane?
they'll be able to hear that. The plane went over, but my microphone's pretty close. So basically the mixtures of sugars will determine how quickly it candies. So some honeys will candy a lot earlier. For instance, we've got the paperbark honey in the valley below. It comes in the wintertime. The wintertime also happens to be a cool time, and the honey will candy in your jar, usually in weeks after you've harvested it. And sometimes even in the hive you'll get a candy or a partial honey as well. So it's a normal process of honey. Don't be scared of it. My kids love what they call the crispy honey, the candied honey. They'll eat over the liquid honey. So you hear these horrible stories of people going, oh, I threw away the honey, it went bad. You're like, oh, okay, what did it do? And I said, oh, it went all like crystallized. You're like, no, it's still good.
No.
It's just changed its texture. And in countries like, in those really cold places like New Zealand or probably up in North America as well, beekeepers will purposefully go for the fine candies where they will seed their honey with a nice fine candy, about 10% of a nice honey that you like the crystalline structure. You put that into your jar or vat, and it will then take on that crystalline structure and become a nice fine candy, which is a delicacy.
Nice. We've got Tizza saying good morning from Burrawa, and they put the super on full to bursting, their brood box, a couple of weeks ago. They're saying there's plenty of bees in the super, but not seeing any waxing going on yet, and just wondering how long it might take.
Okay, it can be a game of patience, and you will find that sometimes they'll go fast, sometimes they'll go slow, and that's primarily due to, as you say, the numbers of bees and the presence of nectar in the environment around. So if they've got lots of flowers and lots of bees, then it usually happens quite quickly. So hang in there, a bit of patience, and you'll see them getting started. But you might even notice that they're starting in the centre and working their way out to the extremities of the hive.
Mm-hmm. It takes them a little while to fill up those little wax gaps in the cells, doesn't it?
Yeah, and they don't really tend to do it till they need it. They might be busy filling some cells in the bottom box. Mm-hmm. What you can also do if you're getting impatient is scrape off some burr comb from the brood nest and just mash it into the flow frame surface. Do it in the window, the frame closest to the window, so you can observe them recycling it. And that, I guess, could speed them up a bit, but mainly it gives you an idea of what they do and how they do it.
Nice one. Hey Cedar, we've got Simon asking that he's giving his bees water in a bowl with rocks in it to keep them afloat, which is good. And he's saying, is it better to give them salt water or tap water?
Okay, so bees need minerals, and Fred Dunn did some great experiments with this, and he got water with a teaspoon of salt in it and water without. And I think his video was called Bees Need Minerals. If anyone can find it, put it in the link below. And he was showing that they really do prefer to have some minerals in their water, and that's why they'll go for swimming pools that are salt pools, and that's why they'll go for mud over fresh water. So yes, a little bit of salt in there will increase the likelihood of the bees using that as a water source.
Wonderful. We've got some climate specific questions we've got the authority to answer, but somebody, Hobos Gold, is saying, when is it too late to put the flow super on? I'm in Victoria.
Okay, so as you say, it's best to get that knowledge from your local beekeepers. Always good to ask around and learn as much as you can from those around you. Now, here we are, we're still in summer for a little bit longer. I would hazard a guess that you might get an autumn flow down there, but ask your local beekeepers. And if your hive's ready for it, then you could put the super on and see if you do get at least some of the frames filled up in the autumn.
Mm-hmm. Abdullah is saying, hello, when's it best to make a split and how many times a year in the subtropical zone?
So subtropical zones are interesting because beekeeping, and all the beekeeping books, they pretty much talk about this winter and summer. Whereas in the tropical zone, it's kind of the same all year round as far as the bees are concerned. They can forage all year round, but what you do have is a big wet season often in those tropical zones, and that can be the time when the bees don't have any flowers to forage on. So it really depends on the flowers around. So if your bees are building up, you can see they're bringing in plenty of nectar, and from local knowledge you know that there's some more coming, then by all means you can go ahead and keep taking splits.
Mm-hmm. Jason's saying good morning from Mayaka, Florida, USA. Got a few people calling in from India. And Catherine's asking, do bees in flow hives still make comb, or do they just seal over the honey?
So in the bottom box, it's the same as it has been for forever almost, since Langstroth designed this kind of hive anyway, and pretty much the same as in a natural cavity, because all we're giving them in the bottom box is wooden sticks, and they hang their natural comb from it. They can, you can put foundation or you can put plastic comb in the bottom if you want to, but we just like to leave it perfectly natural for the bees down there. They can size the cells for themselves, and it's just a bit less work putting in foundation as well. And I find, in order of preference, the bees, if you give them empty, the preference would go empty space. They'll build comb in first, then it would go foundation, then that would be wax foundation, then it goes plastic foundation. So by giving them just empty space, as in just a frame to fill in, they really get in there quite quickly and start building their comb. It does come with a con though, and that's that sometimes they go a bit wonky when you're doing perfectly natural drawn comb in the brood box. So sometimes you do need to fix it up, straighten them out so they can still service the brood nest. Mm-hmm. In the top box, this is where our invention is, and we've given them a partially formed honeycomb cell, as you say, and the bees will then complete all the gaps between the cells and then draw their natural comb out further and fill it with nectar, go through that process of dewatering that nectar, and then eventually when they're happy with the moisture content, they'll seal it off, ready for you to harvest.
It looks like the bees have maybe even started eating some of the comb away where we've harvested.
Oh, look at that. You can see this is the frame we are harvesting, and you can see there
Up there to allow the honey to come down. Hey, Cedar.
Yeah, so that's the pattern, allowing the honeycomb to flow. And when we turn the key again, it'll turn back into their honeycomb shape. Keep questions coming.
Matthew's saying, do we have much of a flow up there now, which you can kind of see coming out the back? And he's also saying, have you noticed much brood colour laying patterns now with the season changing?
What's happening now in this locale is it's a little bit short on nectar. So that's why we're just harvesting a frame. We're going to leave the rest. It's pulsing a little bit though. Every now and then you'll see, when you open the window at the back here, some nectar coming in during the day, and they'll be splashing little droplets around, and then in the evening they'll condense them into cells, but then it won't go again the next day. It was just one day of nectar that hive found. As far as the brood pattern goes, what you find when they're a little bit hungry like that is the queen will start to lay less eggs, and that's their natural process of throttling the size of the hive to the availability of nectar, and that's what they do so that they can survive, because there's no point in having a massive colony and nothing to feed them all. Mm-hmm. So as far as the colours of the brood ranges due to how many times they've used that specific brood comb. So it gets really dark when they've used it for many seasons, and it's really light, almost just a creamy colour when they're using those cells for the first time.
Cedar, you're really selling the honey. Nikki from Wollongong is asking what to do with it all, and do we have a store, an online or a shop for it?
We don't. We have done some collaborations. We made a honey beer with Stone and Wood. But the bulk of the honey actually gets eaten by all of the hungry hive here.
We take it home.
Yeah, everybody takes it home. Most of the staff have a hive at home, but it's surprising how quickly it disappears. It disappears when you put a whole box of jars on the bench. You turn around and it's gone. And also, I give a lot away. So honey's a beautiful gift, and people just love it. So I'm often giving honey away. We have thought a lot about whether we open up a storefront, but we're too busy making hives at the moment.
We've got Bashiri. It's in Las Vegas, Nevada. Loves our hives. He's watched all the videos, become addicted to them, he says. Beyond fascinating. And he's wondering if it's something he can do on his patio, or would the temperature in Las Vegas, Nevada be too hot?
Okay, that's a good question. The patio means you've probably got a covered roof over it, which is quite a nice thing in a really hot time. Here in Australia it gets quite hot. It gets up to 40 degrees here in summer. If somebody could convert that to Fahrenheit for us, that'd be great. So it gets quite hot here in Australia in different parts as well, and the bees are fine. So I dare say it'll be fine in Nevada, and we do have a lot of customers there as well. So ask around about whether there is a temperature issue, but generally you find that bees are very resourceful. They can handle extremes of hot and extremes of cold, and they do that through various air conditioning techniques. So they will look for water when it's really hot. They'll bring that back to the hive. It's one of the last jobs bees get to do in their short life. And they'll use evaporative cooling techniques by fanning that water and lowering the temperature in the hive, because they need to keep this about body temperature. About our body temperature, they need to keep the brood nest for the brood to survive. So that's an important little step, is that piece of air conditioning that the bees have been able to do. Similarly, in the cold, they have a technique where they disconnect their wing muscles and vibrate, and that creates heat, and they're able to keep the hive warm enough. Now, in extreme colds, they will actually stop laying brood because they might not be able to keep it warm enough, and they also know that there's not much nectar around in those times. So they'll just bunker. They'll be doing their thing and warming their hive and keeping their brood chamber warm enough for the bees to survive.
Genius. Hey Cedar, Leanne's saying that she's got a little bit of space between underneath her flow frames where the bees can just get through, and she had trouble when she built the box getting it completely square, and she's asking, do we think that that's why it might be happening?
Okay, you probably have the Araucaria wood, and it's very Western red cedar, like this one, is the most stable wood, but the other woods like the Araucaria do change size a little bit. You notice in your own house the door will start scraping on the floor when the rains come, because the door's actually gotten a little bit bigger. The same thing can happen to these side panels. So what you might find is the if it's a wetter time where you are, it's certainly a wetter time where we are here, the side panels will actually grow in size a little bit, and a gap can open up under the frames. Typically the bees will propolis that up after a while, which is perfect because they're propolising it with a flexible substance that will take up that space. But you can easily fix that quickly by just putting something right under the frames. Just, one of our comb guides that you see in the top of our frames, top of our brood frames, something like that, you can just cut to length and put in that place if you need to block up that gap. Or anything really, if you can find a piece of straw long enough from your garden or whatever, and the bees will quickly get onto that and add some propolis, and it will block up that area. Not ideal, but it's a quick solution because you don't really want the bees escaping from underneath the frames here. The other thing to do, of course, is make sure your frames are pushed all the way this way. Sometimes you can get into a situation where the frames are pushed far back that way, and that's creating a gap between this metal strip here and the bottom of the frames. So that's part of the setup process, is to push the frames this way, and there's a little adjustment screw on the back of the frames to make sure they're pushed up against this face here, and we've got a nice flat window. So I hope that helps, but by all means get in touch with our customer support if you need a bit of a hand to get that sorted. Ideally you don't want any bees when you open the side windows.
Great, thanks Cedar. Got a local one here from Natty down in Ginelabar. She's saying, hi guys, my bees are working the flow frames really well. However, they aren't putting any honey in the back couple of cells, so it looks like there isn't any honey ready to harvest when looking in the back view. But she's pulled the frames out and they are pretty full and capped. So she's wondering what might be going on there.
That's super interesting. We had one hive in amongst 20 that would never fill the back cells. And so there could be a genetic thing there. Light getting in can also do that. Sometimes you'll find if you leave your cover off accidentally, they'll actually move all the honey away from the window. So light getting in could be a factor, but usually just one of these covers is fine to stop enough light and they will fill it. But it may just be genetic as well. So if you're seeing honey in the side windows and it's nice and capped, and you can sort of look down between the frames and see the capping, and as you said, you've pulled some frames out and had a look, then you're good to harvest even though they didn't fill the last cell.
Hey, Abdullah is asking again, while making a split, is there a preference to where the original queen should be? Should she be in the original box or should she go into the new one? And how long until a new queen emerges?
Okay, so taking a split means you're taking some frames out of this hive and putting it into a new box, typically right beside it. And typically we shift the original hive over a little bit so the flight path of the returning bees can go to the little new one. Now it's up to you which one you want to put the queen in. It doesn't actually matter, but which one you put the queen in will have a head start. So we normally will try not to hamper our nice going hive that's producing honey too much, and let the split raise its own queen, or perhaps that's the one we're going to put the new queen in, and leave the old queen. If you've got a really thriving good hive, then you don't want to mess with it too much by changing it all around. You just want to keep it going good, but take away some of the frames to start a new colony. So there's a lot of different things you can do. You can let them raise their own queen, or you can buy one in, and that's up to you as well. If you're letting them raise their own queen, then you'll need to check back often and make sure indeed they have raised their own queen. So the queen cycle is it's a 16-day gestation compared to 21 of a worker bee. So after an egg's laid, then the larvae will be fed royal jelly for its entire larvae stage, and that's something that the bees secrete from them. It's kind of like mother's milk, if you like. As soon as they start feeding plant proteins, usually on about day 3, they'll turn into workers. So queen will get fed exclusively on the royal jelly, and that will not only speed up the process of that queen going through its metamorphosis, but it will also supersize her. So she'll get a longer abdomen, bigger legs, and everything she needs to be a laying queen. Isn't that amazing? You've got this situation where exactly the same genetics, one gets fed one thing, one gets fed another, and one turns into a queen and one doesn't. So it's this incredible display of epigenetics there. And so 16 days is the cycle. So if you're letting them raise their own, then they need eggs to start with. So you would have pulled out some frames with some eggs on them and put them into your split. And 16 days later, you should see a queen cell either just emerged into the hive or ready to emerge. So that's about the time frame. And then it might take another couple of weeks for her to mate, because that is weather dependent. She might mate straight away, or she might mate on the next good sunny day.
Depends who she finds on Bumble, hey?
Yeah, exactly.
Hey, Andrew, he caught a small swarm yesterday about the size of a lawn bowl, he says, and he's wondering, he put him in the flow hive and wondering if he should help feed them sugar syrup to get established, because there's not a great deal of nectar about in New South Wales, Victoria at the moment.
Not a bad idea. I would always suggest feeding bees if they're starving. Like, ideally they collect their own nectar, that's more healthy for them, but it's a choice between starving and possibly dying out, or living on and thriving. Then go ahead and feed them some sugar syrup. So in this case you'll be feeding them probably a thin syrup, simulating nectar, and that would be like a 1-to-1 ratio of sugar to water, and you cook that up, get it all dissolved. And there's various techniques that you can feed them. If you want something just quick and easy, you can even just put the syrup in a Ziploc bag, poke a few pinholes, and take the inner cover, plug out, rest it up under the roof here, and the bees will then get up there and suck away on those pinholes in the Ziploc bag. Or you can use a jar. We've got a video called something like How to Make a Quick and Dirty Feeder, which shows you how to make some of these feeders if you do want to feed your bees. And there's also feeders you can get commercially as well.
Brilliant. Hey, Erin's expecting her bees to arrive in March. She might be in the Northern Hemisphere, I wonder. And she's got her flow hive ready and painted, and asking when her brood box begins to fill up, would it be best to move a frame or two to the super, or just let them naturally find their way to the top?
I tend to advise no. What you get usually is beekeepers who aren't used to the flow hive thinking that's what you should do, and you end up with these situations where they've moved a few frames up here, and you open the window and bees are coming out everywhere and so on. It doesn't really tend to speed up anything that I've noticed. So you're better off just leaving it in this configuration. That's what most people do, and it works just fine. And it's a bit of a game of patience. When the bee numbers are really increasing, lots of bees in the window and a good nectar flow, it'll start happening quite quickly. But until then, they'll probably just use the comb in the bottom box.
Mm-hmm. Hey, going the other way now, Cedar, Susie's asking, so she got her flow hive set up in November in Sydney, and last month she added the super, and there's quite a few inside, but she can't see them making any honey. She's going to do an inspection today, but thinking forward, because we've had all this rain, she's wondering if she should take the super off for a little while to give them a chance to just fill out the brood and get strong again after having such a bad weather patch.
It's nice and warm here. I wouldn't take it off again. I would just exercise a bit of patience and wait till they get up there. If we get most of the way through autumn, because you're in a cooler climate, if I heard correctly, and they haven't really used them, then you would take them off again and reduce the size of the hive down to something that's more suitable for the size of the colony for the winter. But if you've already got it on there and it was a good time to put it on when you put the flow hive super on, then just leave it on there. It's a nice warm time of year, so it won't hamper them. This is in the southern hemisphere. It's so interesting talking about seasonality, because here we are, it's hot and humid here. We're starting to drip sweat, and all of you up in the north of the planet are got snow and things to deal with. It's such different extremes.
Hey Cedar, Amanda's wondering, what does it mean to see aggressive bees, and could we have an example of aggressive behaviour? Okay,
so you will get hives that are aggressive. That's their natural thing, and sometimes your queen will go and mate with some aggressive traits from drones from down the way, and bring those genetics back into the hive. And what you get is a hive that's more territorial, and if that's bothering you, then you might need to do something about it. But if it's not, then you can just let them go on doing their thing. So aggressive behaviour typically starts with you get close to the hive and a bee will come and be really quite erratic like this around your face. Oh, I'm getting out of here before it gets in my hair and stings me on the head. You get a few different patterns. Some bees are sort of sting first, ask questions later, but a lot will tend to give you a bit of a warning by really this kind of aggressive movement around your face saying back off, get out of here. And that's a typical aggressive behaviour of bees. They'll tend to be more territorial on the entrance side of the hive. So bear that in mind. They're fine for you to do this, but you go around the other side of the hive and they're like, this is our entrance, we don't want you here. And they'll get aggressive as they guard that. Now, other bees, like you saw Pete last week, he just did an inspection with no suit on at all. So there's the extremes of bees that get aggressive when you even go near the hive, and others that you can pull right apart and they're so gentle you don't even need to wear a suit, right? So as you get experience in beekeeping, you can experiment like that, but when you're beginning, always wear your suit, wear your gloves, protect yourself. You want to make sure you have positive experiences getting into beekeeping. But yeah, the process, if you do have aggression that you don't want in your hive, is to replace the queen. So queens mate once at the start of their life, so if you're buying in a mated queen with known genetics, then that will change the genetics in the hive after about 3 or 4 weeks, when all of the foragers or guard bees have moved on. So it's called requeening, and beekeepers do that often for various different reasons, but one of them is aggression, and other reasons are things like they might be after a more hygienic queen that keeps chalk brood out of the hive, or they might be looking for just more virile genetics where the queen's going to lay a lot of eggs and the population's going to go boom and they'll bring in a lot of honey.
Fantastic. We've got João, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I used to know a João, he's from Portugal, saying hi from Portugal. Hope you guys are well. And he'd like to know if the bees tend to eat more honey in the times of colder weather.
That's a great question. I certainly noticed that when there's no honey coming in, they will really start to use honey. But the answer is probably no, because in the times of colder weather, what they tend to do is throttle themselves right down, and the queen will even stop laying eggs altogether, which means that they don't have babies to feed. Now, it takes a frame of honey and a frame of pollen to raise a frame of brood. So it really does use a lot of honey, that process of building up the hive and maintaining it at strong numbers. So in the colder times, they'll throttle the numbers down and there'll be less honey consumed by the bees because the colony is getting smaller and they're no longer feeding the brood. And they will also, they will raise what's called fat bees, and that's bees that have a fatter body. They're still worker bees, and they're built to last through the winter. So that's an interesting, another little twist. So the forager bees typically only last, say, 4 or 6 weeks, but the fat bees, where they're built to last and they're not going out foraging, they can last 6 months, or perhaps even longer in those extreme cold places where you get snow for that long. And that's an amazing part of evolution as well.
Hey, popping back to requeening for a second, Cedar, Andrew's wondering about his requeening this weekend for the first time. And he's asking, would we recommend waiting 8 hours after removing the old queen before introducing the new one? What's our experience with not waiting this 8 hours?
So it is quite a discussed topic, and most people will wait a day, just come back the next day and put it in. However, some people do what's called walking the queen in, where they just put the queen on their hand and put it in the entrance and either walk it in straight away or a day later, and that saves that process of coming back and taking the box off again. However, it's disputed the success rate of techniques like that. So probably the most common one is wait a day, probably no longer than a day, but a day's good, and open up the hive again and put your queen in its little queen cage right between the top bars of the brood frames. Put your hive back together and fingers crossed the hive will accept that queen. For those that don't know, she comes in a little cage, and that cage has a block of candy at the end, and the bees will chew away at that candy and she'll be released a day or two later into the hive. And that delay tactic is simply so the hive can get used to her pheromones. Sometimes if you just introduce a queen without that delay, then the colony is more likely to kill the new queen.
We've got Brian asking, is the flow hive the best option for first timers, or should he start with traditional boxes and learn the original art of beekeeping first?
Okay, so about half of our now 100,000 or so around the globe are new to beekeeping, and the flow hive, in my opinion, is a wonderful way to start because, for one, it's got these windows and you can look in and you know, check on bee numbers easily and see honey being produced and things like that. And then, of course, you don't have to get all that extraction equipment depending on which way you want to extract. It all happens right here neatly and easily in the hive, and so the harvesting certainly is very easy compared with conventional methods. So I'd recommend going with a flow hive, and we've got lots of material, lots of videos, and I answer a lot of questions for people to get started also. Have a look at the beekeeper.org as well. We do have an online beekeeping course. It's not strictly flow hives. There's experts from all over the world putting great content into that. But having said all of that, if you want to get any kind of hive, I'd recommend trying it as well. So it's a wonderful thing to just see what works for you. You might want to get a top bar hive, a flow hive, a conventional hive, and just see what you like. You know, extracting honey in the conventional way might be fun for a little while, but you probably prefer this way pretty quickly.
We've got one about varroa mite here from Melissa. She's in a colder area for winter. The bees are going well in the super, but she's going to need to apply a varroa treatment in the next few weeks, which means that she's supposed to take off the super so the treatment doesn't get in the honey. In the flow frames, they have lots of uncapped honey. How do you recommend storing this for winter, or what should we do?
Okay, so on storing a super for winter, the best thing to store frames, if they've still got a bit of honey and nectar in them, is to keep them cold. So in a climate like this, that's in a deep freeze, and that will keep it perfectly good for next time you want to put it back on again. But if you're in a really cold climate, perhaps you don't need a deep freeze because it's freezing anyway. But you'll probably need to keep it away from vermin and things like that that might find a tasty little home in your flow hive box. And then come spring again, you can put it back onto your hive. If you're not in a cold area and you don't want to use a deep freeze, then the best thing you could do is let the bees eat all of the honey. So you might harvest and then let them eat the last remaining bits of honey and put them away when they're dry. If you're in a warm climate and you have nectar left on your frames, then fermentation and mould and things will set in, and that will just be a bit more of a mess for you and the bees to clean up next season. So as far as the varroa treatment goes, then I'm no expert in that because we don't have those pesky varroa mites here in Australia. But if you have a look at the beekeeper.org, we do have training videos on that, and you'll also find lots of information out there on different methods to deal with varroa mites.
Another cold climate question from John living in Canada. Most of the year it's winter where he is, and he's wondering if it's worth to buy this product. How long would it take to start and harvest with only 6 to 7 months of warm or hot weather where he is?
So one of the very first flow hives we tested in the world, because my father and I were inventing this for a decade, and we're like, okay, it's time to let our baby out. And we posted them off around the world. And one place we sent them to was Canada. And John Gates, their very experienced commercial beekeeper, did some tests with the flow hive, and he was amazed at the performance of it, how quickly it filled up and how easy it was to harvest the honey, and also how the flavour was different because you're harvesting directly into your jar and there's no processing, so you're retaining much more of the flavour as well. And he said, oh no, I don't give my Flow Hive honey away to anyone. So long story short, Canada is a great place for Flow Hive beekeeping as well. We have lots of customers there, and what you get in a climate like that is you get a season, as you say, that is really compressed. So a long winter to nurture your bees through, but then when it flowers, everything's flowering at once. So you literally got nectar dripping to the ground, left, right and centre. The bees build up very fast, and it gets really quite exciting. I heard of a story in Canada where a whole super was filled in a day. Hard to believe. The fastest we ever see it here is about a week, but a day is extreme. So yes, Canada is a wonderful place for beekeeping.
Amazing. Speaking of premium honey, we've got, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Rachuaka is in Fiji, and wondering if honey can be graded or not, and if yes, how can they grade it?
Interesting. So people really are cherishing the Flow Hive honey because you're going single frames straight to the jar, and that means one frame might be this kind of auburn colour, and another might be really light yellow, and another one might be almost black, and through that process you're really isolating different flavours, and that's a wonderful thing to be able to share. And some people are telling that story when they're marketing their honey as well, and people are really appreciating the fact that it's had zero processing and it's a single frame honey, so each flavour is a bit unique to each frame. As far as grading goes, there is some taste testing literature that we have put out in the past. We'll see if we can find a link to it, if someone could put a link in our comments, where it just helps you go through the process of learning to taste test and appreciate the fine nuances of honey, and then and the viscosities and so on, like they do when they're doing honey competitions.
Beautiful. Nice. We've got Joel saying that he's just put his new Flow Hive set up and got together and had some bees put in by a local beekeeper, and the local beekeeper recommended closing the entrance up so it's only a quarter of the size. Is that good practice?
Okay, it's something that some people do. I don't know if we've got one right here with me, but we have an entrance reducer that can close it up, but you can just use anything. It really depends. If it's a hive on its own and you're in a warm climate, I wouldn't bother, because the likelihood of another hive coming to steal its honey as it's getting on its feet is pretty low, and they migration at the moment in this hot time of year, if you are indeed in a hot place. So I would just leave it open, but it doesn't hurt to close it as well. So one thing you can do, which is interesting, is you can get some straw from the garden and poke it in the entrance, and the bees will pull that out if they don't want it there and open up the entrance. That's a technique you can use if there's robbing as well. You can poke straw in there all the way down to just one bee wide, and that'll give them a much easier hive to defend if there's robber bees around. And they'll just clean that out again, so you don't necessarily have to go back to that hive again. The bees will deal with it and take away the entrance reducer as needed.
VB is asking if it's normal for bees to fill up the middle brood frames with honey.
The middle brood frames with honey is unusual. Typically, they'll start their colony in the centre and move out towards the extremities. So we're down here in the bottom box. But sometimes it's lopsided, and you'll find that the brood nest is all over one side and the honey's on the other side. Just depends a little bit where they have started. But they usually will strive to have the honey on the edges, because it's a thermal mass and acts as a bit of insulation that helps them keep the centre at the temperature they want to. So that is unusual. If you're seeing that, do check that you have indeed got larvae and brood in your hive. Sometimes you can get in a situation where the queen has died or no longer laying, and the bees just fill all the frames with honey down the bottom, and the colony is slowly dwindling at that point.
Hey Cedar, Scott has just installed his first nuke this last week gone, and they're bringing in pollen, he can see. And he's wondering, does that mean that there's likely a nectar flow on? And is there any way of identifying a flow without opening the brood box? He's located in southeast Queensland.
Yes, there's an old technique called hefting the hive, which simply means you haven't got the top box on, the hive isn't that heavy, but if you just feel the weight at the back, and over time you should notice it getting heavier if they are on a flow and bringing in the nectar. But if it's just staying the same and it's light, then they might not actually have a nectar flow at the time. Sometimes you'll find plants that will be producing good pollen but not nectar, and that means you'll see the pollen coming in but you're still not getting nectar stored in your frames. So you can't necessarily tell by looking at the entrance. Looking at the behaviour, you can a bit. So when the bees are on a really good flow, they tend to fly out with purpose, up and away, and they'll set up a good flight path. And that's when there's a really solid nectar flow. They're just on it like a train, they're just after it. And when they're not on a nectar flow, they'll tend to be sort of searching more and looking around and wandering more aimlessly, looking for a good nectar source to come back and tell the hive about.
Hey, Rena's asking, how often do you have to change the frames in the super?
Okay, so we've built them to last a long time, and you should get many, many seasons out of them. If you have any trouble, do get in contact with us and we'll help you out. And we're still finding out about it ourselves. That we're now 7 years in, and we've got plenty of hives that are 7 years in and still functioning great. So hopefully they'll last you many, many years.
This is a related sort of question. We've got Sam saying, is there a reliable way to clean the float frames after years of use?
So I've experimented a lot with this, because after a while they get grimy and it's a bit annoying. You're looking at this window and it doesn't look as rosy as it once did, and it's covered in wax and propolis, and it's kind of brown, and it gets harder to get this beautiful view and cross section of the comb. And we've tried all sorts of solvents and things, and it's actually really hard to get beeswax off. But one thing that does work is a hot water pressure washer. So you can buy hot water pressure washers, but they're quite expensive. Or you can use a standard cheap pressure washer and feed it with hot water from perhaps your laundry tap. But it does need to be above the wax melt temperature of 63 degrees Celsius. So you want it about 70 degrees, and then you'll be able to blast that old wax and grime off and bring it back to looking closer to this again.
Nice. Hey, Dee's in Canberra and Yass, and saying, do we suggest like the 7 frame for where they are, or would the 6 be okay?
You could go either way there. You'll find beekeepers that keep this size, which is the 6 or 8 frame Langstroth size, and you'll also find beekeepers that keep the bigger size. Typically in the colder areas, people do prefer the larger size. You do get quite a cold winter in that area, but having said that, you'll probably find a bit of a mixture amongst beekeepers, so your hive should be fine either way.
Awesome. Brooke's thinking about buying a flow hive, but has heard someone say that the bees can get hurt when we turn the lever and drain the honey. What do you got to say about that, Cedar?
Okay, we put a lot of attention into that. The concept of inventing the flow hive was to make it gentle on the bees and easier for us. I'm happy to say we have achieved that after a decade of trying things and failing and trying and failing. So one of the important design features that my father and I built into the hive was to make sure the space for the bee's knees. And if you got a honeycomb cell like that, and let's say even if the bees have built their wax onto it and drawn it out like they do, let's say there's an area of the comb and the bees are all down there when you harvest. Let's say there's an empty area for some reason, the bees are all down there when you harvest. if you have the parts meeting like that as they move, there's potential for the bees to put a wing or a leg or something through that area when it closes to catch it. So what we did in design is we made it so the bees have to build that area themselves. So the parts resemble more like that with this V shape out of it. The bees then build this wax bridge. So what happens when you move like that is that wax breaks and becomes free, and then it moves back and you've got a gap there. At the very worst, the bees can only get trapped in their wax, which means the other bees will help free them, or they'll free themselves quickly enough because it's only their own wax that's moving around a little bit. So that was an important step, and I would confidently say that it's definitely less disturbance and definitely more gentle for the bees harvesting honey in this way than conventional.
Yeah, nice. Last question maybe I think today is from Neil. He's asking for a shout out all the way over in the UK and says it gets cold where he is, and he's just about to, it's getting cold. So how do you prep a hive for winter, and do you need 2 hives to prevent swarms, as he's about to buy a flow hive? He's wondering if he needs 1 or 2.
Okay, I would always say it's better than 1. I might be a bit biased there because I love bees and beekeeping and honey. But the reason why I say that is because, for one, you can benchmark it. You'll typically get, if you get 2 hives, one that's doing great one season and the other one not so much. So it means you're more likely to get some produce as well. But also, if you run into trouble where one hive loses its queen, you can get some brood from this hive with some eggs down the cells and put it into the other one. They can raise their own queen from it. So it makes you more self-sufficient, if you like, in your beekeeping. It might take you some time to rectify that situation if you've got to get a mail order queen, or you've got to get a frame off somebody else. Whereas if you can fix it right then and there, it's much better. So a couple of hives is better than 1. But having said that, if you want to tiptoe into it, then get 1 and build up from there.
Awesome, thanks Cedar.
Okay, our harvest is just about finished. Thank you very much for tuning in and all your great questions. You could wait for this jar to fill up, right, if you had the time, or at this stage you can just let the rest go back into the hive for the bees. And what we did is we designed a little point for that to happen, and I'll show you all about that in a second. First of all, we're taking this key out, as you saw me do, and we're putting it into the top slot. There's 2 slots here. Now this is an important stage, and if you forget to do this, then the cap won't fit in the top. And that was a little reminder, because we found even ourselves as we were inventing it, we're forgetting to return the honey back the way. Okay, so you probably see that use that wax to reform the cell, and away they go again. Now, one little tip, leave your key like that for a minute or so if you can, because wax and propolis kind of resist movement. They're slow moving stuff, and you want all the parts really to seat down into place properly. If you do the quick close like this, you just go boom and then walk away, you might find your parts have bounced back up and you get into trouble later on down the track. You can get things happening where you're not quite getting enough movement to harvest, or there's that they're sitting up like this and you've got wax blobs down here stopping the flow of honey, causing spills in the hive later and things like that. So leave it in the position like that for a minute, just while you're packing up, and that will help push all those parts back to where they should be. Now, taking this comb out, this tube out, sorry, and putting this cap in, there's still a little gap there, and I'll put this sideways. You might even be able to see what's going on there, but right under here, the remaining drops are going back into the hive, and after a while you'll even see the bees' tongues licking away and licking up that that remaining honey there. I can show you in another frame here what that looks like. So down the bottom there's this gap that looks like the parts aren't quite meeting properly, but that's on purpose. And the cap itself that goes in has a...
Cedar, is that a bee tongue?
There is a little bee tongue there. It's licking because there's a little honey there. So there's little bee tongues licking around. You can see that. They can lick about 7 millimeters through a gap. They poke their heads through a little bit and their tongue pokes out. It's covered in kind of these branched hairs, and they're able to mop it up, if you like, and bring that back into their mouth. But here's got the little ridges, so that's just made so there's still a bee tongue worth of gap, but not big enough typically that ants can crawl through that area. And any remaining. Now sometimes the bees will block that up when it's dried out, and you'll need to unblock that. So it's one little piece of maintenance you can do from time to time. You can unblock it with the key here, or the tube automatically unblocks it each time you harvest. When you insert that tube, that tongue unblocks that little leak back point, we call it. Thanks so much for all your wonderful questions. Have a look at the beekeeper.org if you really want to get some training material that's quite in depth, made to take you from square one right through to deep, even scientific knowledge of beekeeping. Experts from all around the world providing amazing content for that. It's getting rave reviews, so have a look at that if you do want to sink your teeth right into some education around keeping bees. And of course, think up your questions for next week. Let us know. If there's something specific you'd like me to cover, then send through your ideas. Same time next week, we'll have something interesting to show you. Thanks for tuning in.